What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, Alan Parr is going to be giving us 6 pieces of evidence for God's existence. Since this is Alan's definitive attempt at proving that God exists, I am only going to expect the best evidence within this video. Hopefully, he won't disappoint, but we'll see. If you want to fuck around and find out if Alan Parr can prove that God exists, then please stay tuned.
Okay, so if you've ever wondered the question, I can't see God, I can't smell God, but how do I know if he really exists or this whole thing that we see in our universe is just happening by chance? So here are 6 proofs that I want to give you, and 2 of them come from the Bible and the other 4 do not.
Oh, great. So we're starting with 2 proofs from the Bible? The Bible can't be used as a proof for God because 1, the Bible is a claim to a specific God, and 2, any argument using the Bible is pretty much just for the Bible tells me so. Nothing in the Bible is substantiated with evidence. It's just ad hoc speculation with a little bit of historical information in order to justify the God of Abraham. This book simply can't be used as evidence of anything other than what this one group believed. But okay, let's hear your first 2 biblical proofs for God.
The first proof is what we'll call an internal witness. Now, this is the idea that deep down inside of every single human being, there is this deep internal sense that there must be a God who exists.
Okay, I've cut a lot of stuff out here because Alan goes on to provide biblical references as well as a diatribe on how atheists really know that God exists, but they suppress that knowledge. He speculates that atheists are either lying to themselves or just lying in general. His only solution to this is telling people what they think, thereby denying them what they really think. I kind of feel like when an apologist does this, it's purely because they can't handle the fact that atheists exist. This would be a classic example of cognitive dissonance. To cope with the fact that atheists do exist, the only recourse they have is to deny that atheists even exist. Personally, I find this to be a truly sad position to take. Another position that Alan seems to simultaneously take is that everybody in the world is inclined to believe in a God. Of course, he takes this as meaning that there has to be a God in existence. Religion has pretty much dominated the world since the first occurrence of a phenomenon that we couldn't explain. And this, yet again, is another instance of cognitive dissonance. We don't understand how something like whatever phenomenon it is could happen, and the only way to get around this uncomfortable feeling of not knowing something, we make up something that already fits within our preconceived notions. Apparently, a magical bearded man in the sky that controls everything is easily believable. I wonder what his next proof from the Bible is.
So the second proof we'll call the external witness. And this is the idea that not only has God placed it in the heart of every person, deep down intrinsically, that they know that there has to be a God somewhere out there, but now God has left enough proof externally, specifically in nature, to be able to look around and anyone
Look at the trees! This is by far the worst argument ever. Of course, he supports this with more Bible verses as well as another diatribe that I've cut out for time's sake. If you're interested in Alan's full arguments for both of these proofs, I've linked the original video down in the description. But back to his whole look at the trees argument. Nature does not require a God to function, so it's quite irrational to state nature as a proof for God. Now, Alan could claim that nature requires a God in order to function, but that would just be a presupposition. This is just a poor tactic to get around the need to prove that God is required for nature to function. Alan just circumvents the entire need to prove this connection by presupposing that God is needed. Ultimately, at least for Alan's case here, this is just another example of For the Bible tells me so. Now, with all that biblical bullshit out of the way, what are your real proofs for God?
Okay, so now these next 4 proofs are what we'll call the traditional proofs that people have given over hundreds of years, centuries of years.
Oh, so just regurgitated shit that we've heard for many, many years now. Let me remind you, this is supposed to be Alan's definitive list of proofs for God. And he's just gonna feed us the same bullshit that's been refuted time and time again. Well, fuck me.
And the first one we'll look at is what's called the Cosmological Argument. And this word comes from the idea of cosmos, or the universe. Now, I'm going to go ahead and read an excerpt from Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology book, which describes it in this way. He says, every known thing in the universe has a cause. Therefore, it reasons the universe itself must also have a cause. And the cause of such a great universe can only be God.
So normally, we experience a cause preceding an effect. The inclination is that that is how it always happens. We could somewhat compare this to the flow of time. One unit of time precedes the next unit of time in an orderly fashion. And this would be the normal way that we experience time. But we do know that that's not always how time flows. Einstein, for instance, has proved that space and time are linked. Time would either speed up or slow down depending on the speed that you're going relative to some other object. Also, gravity can bend time. Time is therefore not some uniform phenomenon that is accurately represented by our normal experiences. In much the same way, cause and effect is not a uniform phenomenon that is accurately represented by our normal experiences. For example, radioactive decay gives us a really good way of measuring long time periods. The rate of decay for isotopes is constant, and we know why they decay. What we don't know is what causes an individual atom in a sample to decay. For all we know, there is no discernible cause that would indicate which atom would decay next. Another example is on a quantum scale, the effects can precede the causes. This is especially significant because the inflation of our universe is best explained by the fluctuation of a quantum scalar field that moves from a false vacuum state to a true vacuum state. And when it does this, it releases an immense amount of energy that inflated the universe and transformed from inflaton particles into what would eventually become normal matter. After that point, the universe continued to expand. So my contention with a traditional cosmological argument is that not everything that exists necessarily has a cause. 2, I agree that something happened to inflate our universe, but because nature doesn't require a god in order to function, I think that it most likely happened naturally. 3, there's no logical reason to think that infinite regresses are impossible. And 4, the argument is ultimately just special pleading. The cosmological argument specially pleads that God didn't need a creator or didn't need a cause. And so therefore he is the ultimate cause for everything. Even if you grant that everything has a cause and we come to the conclusion that the universe has a cause, it would be a giant leap in logic to suppose that a god is that cause. And if everything requires a cause, why doesn't God require a cause? You see, you have to leap from the universe has a cause to God is that cause. You need to build a bridge using evidence that connects the beginning of the universe to God. Apologists simply never do this.
Now, let me just kind of break that down in layman's terms. Let's just say we have this phone right here. Well, as we look at this phone had to have a cause of some sort. Something had to cause this phone to be here, right? Or this cup right here, or these glasses right here. Something had to cause this to come into existence. And so if we keep tracing the cause back and say, okay, well, what caused the plastic to be on this set of glasses? Okay, then what caused the plastic to be able to be created? Or what caused the resistors in here to be able to be created? And we keep tracing that cause and that cause back to that cause. And who caused that? What caused that? We're basically going to end up with a universe with nothing in it except stars, sun, moon, or whatnot.
Right. We can trace everything back to the inflation of the universe, and beyond that, we don't know what happened. And that's okay. It also doesn't mean that the regress of causes stops right there. That's an assumption that apologists make. In this section, I feel like Alan has exposed his ignorance of the scientific explanation for the inflation of the universe. There was a period of about 300,000 years after the inflation of the universe of immense heat that permeated all throughout the known universe. It was so hot that not even light could travel through it. The subatomic particles did not form atoms until the universe was able to cool enough. Alan seems to indicate that this regress of causes only goes back to the formation of our solar system. That only takes us back about 4.5 billion years. There's another 9 billion years prior to that.
And then at this point, we have two options. Option one, God caused the universe that we have today. If you get to that conclusion that God is the source and the cause of everything, then you've already gotten to the place that you need to be. Now, the other possibility in terms of how we got our universe is this idea of the Big Bang Theory. But then you're stuck there, because if you go with that route, then you have to come up with some sort of conclusion or explanation, if you will, on what caused the Big Bang. And then you have to come up with the explanation of who was the person who actually caused it.
This is basic begging the question. First, we have a more plausible explanation for the inflation of the universe. The universe doesn't need a creator any more than rain does. And just like rain, the inflation of the universe was a natural process. Assuming that there needs to be some conscious being in order for the inflation of the universe to happen only begs the question, because you're assuming the conclusion in the question. This is also a false dichotomy, because he presents it as either his God or a natural explanation. If we are going to include a God hypothesis, then you would also have to include all other creation hypotheses. God did it is no different than a snake vomiting out the universe, which is another creation myth. There isn't any evidence that either of them occurred. What we do have evidence for is a fluctuation in a quantum scalar field that inflated the entire universe.
And then who was the person who created the two things, or however many things that came together to make the Big Bang? And so if you keep tracing those things back, you'll ultimately get back to there has to be a cause for this. And that cause is God, who we call the uncaused cause.
Nobody caused the inflation of the universe. Alan is still just begging the question. And the way that Alan describes the Big Bang makes it sound like some caveman was banging two rocks together and then this happened.
Smoke weed every day.
This is such a bad understanding of the inflation of the universe. Our education system has obviously failed him.
Okay, so the fourth argument is called the Teleological Argument, and that comes from the word telos, which is from the idea of end or purpose. Now, this argument, basically, I'm going to read back from Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology book, and he says it focuses on the evidence of harmony, order, and design in the universe, and argues that its design gives evidence of an intelligent purpose.
I would love for him to explain how it does this. I would also love for him to explain the difference between designed and undesigned objects. Is the water cycle designed by God? What about the rock cycle? Because both of those things seem to just follow the laws of nature. I guess at that point, he would have to say that God is necessary for the laws of nature to function, but he doesn't have any evidence to suggest this. If something seems to be complex, that doesn't necessarily mean an intelligence is required for that object to exist. If there is no natural explanation for how something came into existence, then it could be design. But the problem is that we have natural explanations for everything that he would list as needing a God in order to explain them. If we have natural explanations, then we don't need a supernatural explanation.
So the idea of this is one I love. Basically, the idea is if you look at the universe that we have today, it necessitates that there had to be an intelligent design or designer, that everything that we see didn't just come from happenstance, right? the sun being in a position that it is, it's not just happen. It doesn't just happen to be there. If it was further away, we would freeze up. If it was closer, we would burn up. There is an intelligent design that placed that sun right in the ideal situation.
The sun wasn't placed anywhere. You know, that's very geocentric of you. You see, the sun formed, and then due to the gravitational effect of the sun, planets formed around it. The sun was not placed specifically for the Earth. If anything, our planet would have been placed in the right position around the sun. But that statement is also begging the question, because you're assuming that planets were placed at all. It's true that our planet did form in the Goldilocks zone around our sun, the same as 5 billion other planets in the Milky Way galaxy alone. We aren't so special that it requires a god. Another thing to consider here is that the Earth has about a 1.5 million mile deviation towards and away from the sun during its yearly rotation. He seems to think that we orbit around the sun in a perfect circle. We don't do that. In fact, no planets do that. All planets travel in an elliptical orbit around the sun. Our orbit would have to drastically change in order for our planet to become uninhabitable. It's also true that there are several conditions required for a planet to support life. Again, these conditions don't make us any more special than the other 5 billion possible habitable planets in the Milky Way galaxy alone. It just means that in comparison to the 100 to 400 billion other planets in the Milky Way galaxy, life-supporting planets are very rare.
There's an intelligent design that knows just how much rainfall needs to come down on this Earth, where if it's too much, we'll drown. If it's not enough, we won't be able to survive. There's an intelligence going on that's sustaining everything.
Okay, so you've regressed backward into thinking that God controls rain. Like I've said plenty of times before in this video already, the water cycle is controlled by physics, not God. That's why flash floods and other natural disasters happen, Alan. Also, as a side note, there's not enough moisture in the air where if it were to all come down at once, we would drown. If God is in control of all of this shit, then that means that God specifically sends natural disasters to kill 60,000 people a year. Does anyone really want to say that God is in control of this shit?
Now let's break it down into simpler terms. Let's once again go back to the cell phone. This cell phone is made of batteries, resistors, capacitors, and who knows what else. Plastic, if you will, whatever. So if I just take a whole bunch of parts from a store, if you will, Radio Shack, I get a whole bunch of parts, batteries, resistors, and I throw them all in this cup and I just shake them up, right? I'm not going to be able to take all those parts out and, whoa, it pops a cell phone that I can call people all across the world, right? It doesn't work like that, right? So this idea of just throwing things together and causing them to bang together doesn't necessarily result, or it will not result in something that is going to work, right?
Well, not for cell phones, genius. Cell phones are man-made objects, so obviously they do need an intelligence to put them together. We don't have a natural process that would explain why a cell phone would come into existence all on its own. This is an example of an equivalence fallacy. He compares man-made objects to the natural world and then suggests that we also need an intelligence in order to explain the natural world. You cannot compare those two things, because if we have a natural explanation for something, that means that we don't need a supernatural explanation. I know that he thinks that God controls the water cycle, but normal people understand that physics is what governs the water cycle. We don't need a supernatural being in order to make the water cycle operate. The same can be said about the rest of the natural world.
So the idea is that as we look at our world, as we look at even childbirth, how babies are born, the miracle of childbirth, and all sorts of other things, there has to be an intelligent designer that is behind all these things that are making it work.
I know a lot of people out there think that childbirth is a miracle, but he seems to have never seen a child being born. And I don't suggest that you watch a child being born if you have a weak stomach. I really don't know why people think that God is required for childbirth.
Oh, get out! Oh, no!
What did he look like?
I shouldn't have gone in there. Don't go in there. Promise me you don't go in there.
Me go in there?
That's the last fucking place I want to go. Like, I'm gonna go in there.
Oh, did you know that you could potentially shit yourself during childbirth? Childbirth is a perfectly natural process that has occurred for millions and millions, if not billions of years. And no supernatural deity is needed for natural processes to work.
Now, the fifth argument is what's called the moral argument. And this is the idea that basically inherent in every single person who has ever existed is this idea of right and wrong. Now, do some people go against their own conscience and do wrong? Of course, we all do. But inherently, let's be honest, we all have a common sense of certain things being right and certain things being wrong.
We do this, but it's because of societies and how societies have evolved. Successful societies have this common moral foundation that allow them to survive and thrive. Social norms established by societies change over time, and those in turn will change that common moral foundation. There's never been one moral foundation to rule them all. That's why our common moral foundation has changed over time. We see drastic changes in our morality with slavery, women's rights, and the rights of LGBTQ individuals.
We understand that it is wrong to molest a child. We understand that it is wrong to take the innocent life of somebody. We understand all these things are wrong. Where did that come from? Where did this idea of this is right and no, this is wrong come from? It had to have come from God.
This is yet another mindfuck. How can you sit there and say that it's only because of God that we know not to take an innocent life or to molest a child? Let's take a look at Numbers 31:17-18. Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man, for totally not sex slave reasons. Now, that seems like God is commanding his chosen people to take innocent lives and then abduct young girls for sexual slavery. Now, tell me again how God is required in order for us to know that these are shitty things to do. Seems to me like God has no problem with killing innocent people and molesting young children. Well, I guess as long as God tells you to do it, it's perfectly fine. These two things are societal norms that are geared towards the survival of humans. We know that sexually assaulting anyone, let alone a child, is severely detrimental to them and does only harm. We also know that killing innocent people in a society is not only harmful for that society, but for individuals within that society. God is not required to understand these things.
Because if it didn't come from God, then that means that every single person on earth would have their own separate standard of morality versus there being a general common morality that is shared amongst all human beings. And that could have only come from a morally perfect being, i.e. God.
Every single person on earth has their own standard of morality. It just so happens that everyone living in one society generally has these overlapping standards that we call the common moral foundation. This would be the foundation that includes most people in the society. He also seems to have this idea that everybody on the face of this earth has this one singular common moral foundation. They don't. Psychopaths and sociopaths certainly don't. Generally, with this moral argument, an apologist will tell you that God has written these things on our hearts, so everybody on earth knows these things implicitly. This fails to explain why psychopaths take joy in inflicting pain on others, or why sociopaths can't empathize with their fellow man. Claiming that God has given us this common moral foundation only causes more questions than it gives answers.
Okay, and the sixth and final proof is a difficult one to wrap your mind around, and it's the ontological argument. And the idea here is, if you can imagine some great maximal being, if you will, right? If you can imagine that being in your mind that can do all these things, that's all powerful, all knowing, that is all sovereign and in control of all things. But if that being only exists in your mind and you're only able to just imagine him, but he doesn't really exist, then that means by default, he can't be the maximum being, i.e. God. There has to be another being out there that is greater than the one that you've actually imagined, because now this being not only exists in your consciousness, but also exists actually in reality as well. And so therefore, there has to be a greater God.
Okay. Well, I can imagine a maximally great house with 15 movie theaters and a garage full of vintage cars, but that doesn't make it real. It also doesn't mean that there is some other house out there with 16 movie theaters and 2 garages full of vintage cars. Just because I can imagine something that I think is awesome does not mean that that has to exist in reality now.
Basically the argument is this: if you can imagine that there is a possibility of there being a God, then that means there has to exist the fact that there is a God.
Are you fucking serious right now? Does this work for anything, or is it just your God? Which, by the way, would be special pleading. I can imagine a T-Rex walking around downtown Huntsville. Does that mean that there really is a T-Rex walking around downtown Huntsville? You can imagine a whole ton of shit. Fantasy and science fiction primarily rely on this imagination. Does that mean that anything in fantasy or science fiction media is real just because somebody thought about it? This is such a ridiculous argument.
Yeah, I know. That's a tough one to wrap your mind around. I get it. Okay, my friends, so there are 6 proofs of God's existence.
Ooh, that last one did throw me a little bit. I mean, by far, it is the dumbest argument that I've heard for God. As far as I can tell with this video, the first 2 proofs are just, "for the Bible tells me so," and then the other 4 proofs failed to substantiate the conclusion that he came to. Like he said at the very beginning of the video, these are the exact same arguments that have been regurgitated for many, many years. And they have been refuted for many, many years as well. I'm not sure why these arguments are convincing to anybody when they use an archaic understanding of reality.
Can we touch them? Can we feel them? Can we smell them? Not necessarily, but God has left enough proof internally as well as externally of his existence. So
He really hasn't, though. If God had provided us with enough evidence to indicate that he definitely does exist, then we would have situations that would only be able to be explained by a supernatural deity. The problem is that what we're left with are natural explanations for everything that we've experienced in reality. I don't see how that could ever hope to prove that God exists. Thank you, heathens, for joining me for this video today. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you think of Alan Parr's proofs for God. Do you think they're convincing or do you not? Let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.